The Donovan mansion sat atop the hills like a fortress of wealth, its marble pillars reaching up toward the sky, reflecting a kind of grandeur that seemed untouchable. Inside its walls, everything glittered: crystal chandeliers, priceless paintings, gold-trimmed furniture. To those outside the gates, it appeared a dream. But for Adrian Donovan, the only son of the millionaire magnate, it had always felt more like a gilded cage. Adrian grew up in a world of privilege, where everything was handed to him on a silver platter, except for the one thing he craved most: a life of his own. Mr. Donovan, a man of immense power and influence, had meticulously controlled every aspect of his son's life. From the schools Adrian attended to the friends he was allowed to keep, nothing escaped his father's watchful eyes. He was groomed to inherit the family empire, but despite the luxury surrounding him, Adrian found no joy in it. His father's empire thrived on wealth, but it lacked warmth, and Adrian yearned for something genuine, something that couldn't be bought. He would often retreat to the quiet corners of the mansion to escape the suffocating pressures of high society. It was in these secluded moments that he noticed her, Maria. She had worked in the Donovan household since Adrian was a teenager. A maid unseen by the family except when needed, Maria moved through the mansion like a ghost, quietly tending to every detail of the house. But to Adrian, she was far more than a faceless servant. He admired the way she carried herself with grace and dignity, even in a role that left her largely invisible to those around her. Maria had a calmness about her that soothed him. In her, Adrian saw authenticity, an antidote to the artificiality of the world he'd been born into. It began with small, stolen moments, glances exchanged in the hallways, fleeting conversations as she cleaned his room, and quiet smiles that spoke louder than words. Over time, their connection deepened. Maria, too, noticed Adrian's silent rebellion against his father's expectations. She saw the way he distanced himself from the wealth that surrounded him, choosing solitude over the parties and galas his father hosted. At first, she kept her feelings for him hidden, knowing the vast divide that separated their worlds. She, a maid, was someone his father would never deem worthy of Adrian's affection. But the more time they spent together, the more undeniable their bond became. Adrian's growing love for Maria was both exhilarating and terrifying. He knew what his father's reaction would be if he discovered their relationship. Mr. Donovan had big plans for his son, plans that included marrying into one of the most influential families in the country. A union with a maid was not only unthinkable, it was an act of rebellion that could tear the family apart. But Adrian's love for Maria was real, unlike anything he had ever experienced. She wasn't interested in his money or the Donovan name. She loved him for who he was, not what he could offer her. For the first time in his life, Adrian felt seen for the person he truly was, not as the heir to a vast fortune, but as a man who longed for love. The turning point came one late evening. It was a quiet night in the mansion. The house was still and most of the staff had retired to their quarters. Adrian found Maria in the garden, the moonlight casting a soft glow on her as she watered the roses near the stone fountain. Her face, usually serious and focused on her tasks, seemed at peace in the gentle embrace of the evening. "Maria," Adrian called softly as he approached her. She turned, a small smile playing on her lips as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Adrian, you shouldn't be out here. If your father—" "I don't care what my father thinks," Adrian interrupted, stepping closer. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency in his tone. "I'm done living by his rules." Maria looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Maria," Adrian said, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've loved you for a long time now. I can't hide it anymore." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had known. Deep down, she had always known. But hearing the words out loud, in the stillness of the garden, made it real in a way that terrified her. "Adrian, your father would never allow—" "I don't care about his approval," Adrian cut in. His voice was firm, but his eyes pleaded with her. "I'm tired of living for someone else's expectations. I want a life with you, Maria, not one dictated by my father's wealth or power." For a long moment, Maria stood in stunned silence, torn between the deep love she felt for Adrian and the fear of the consequences. But then, she looked into his eyes and saw the sincerity there. He wasn't making a rash decision. He was offering her his heart, his future. Slowly she nodded. "I love you too, Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Adrian pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, they let themselves believe in the possibility of a future together, a future built on love, not wealth or power. From that night on, their relationship was no longer a secret to them, but it still had to be hidden from the rest of the world, especially Mr. Donovan. They met in quiet corners of the mansion, shared stolen moments of tenderness in the garden, and exchanged letters to avoid suspicion. Each encounter was a delicate dance between passion and fear. But Adrian knew that secrecy couldn't last forever. The longer they kept their love hidden, the more restless he became. He was tired of living in the shadows, tired of pretending that Maria wasn't the most important person in his life. One day, as he watched Maria working in the mansion's grand hall, moving about with her usual grace, Adrian made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer hide his love for her. He would defy his father's expectations, no matter the cost. That night, as the Donovan mansion glowed with opulence, Adrian resolved to ask Maria to be his wife, knowing that his choice would ignite a firestorm of opposition from his father. But he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was ready to take control of his own destiny, and nothing, not even Mr. Donovan's iron will, would stop him. The day of the wedding dawned with a tension that hung thick in the air, as though the mansion itself sensed the storm brewing. The Donovan estate had never been busier. Staff rushed from room to room, making final preparations, while florists and decorators moved with frantic energy to prepare the venue for the most anticipated event of the year. But this was not the wedding anyone had imagined. Adrian Donovan, the only son of the millionaire Mr. Donovan, was getting married. However, the bride was not from a family of wealth or prestige. She wasn't a business mogul's daughter or a socialite groomed for the high life. She was Maria, the maid who had quietly served the Donovan household for years, the woman who had won Adrian's heart against all odds. As the mansion buzzed with preparations, a darker, more palpable energy swirled within its walls. The tension between father and son had reached a breaking point. For weeks, ever since Adrian had declared his intention to marry Maria, Mr. Donovan had been simmering with barely contained fury. His empire was built on power, on maintaining the perfect image of wealth and influence. To him, Adrian's choice was not just a betrayal, it was a threat to everything he had worked for. The confrontation hours before the ceremony, in the grand library of the mansion, the final showdown between father and son began. Mr. Donovan, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored suit, stood by the large bay windows, his back to the door. His tall frame cast a long shadow over the room, the sunlight filtering in to create an almost regal halo around him. The bookshelves that lined the walls were filled with the chronicles of power, business strategy, politics, biographies of the wealthy elite. It was a room designed to intimidate, to remind anyone who entered of the sheer weight of the Donovan legacy. Adrian walked in, dressed in his wedding suit. His black tuxedo fit him perfectly, but there was nothing ordinary about this moment. His face was set with determination, yet beneath the surface, a storm of emotions raged. He knew what was coming, his father's final attempt to break him, to bend him to his will. "Father," Adrian said, his voice calm but firm as he approached the center of the room. Mr. Donovan didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed on the sprawling garden outside, where rows of white chairs were set up for the ceremony. "You're throwing everything away," he said in a low voice, his tone cutting like a knife. "Do you understand that?" Adrian's jaw tightened. He had heard these words before, but today they held a finality that weighed heavily on his chest. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing what matters." At this, Mr. Donovan turned to face his son, his icy blue eyes locking onto Adrian's with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "What matters?" he scoffed. "Do you think love will fill your bank accounts? Do you think a life with her will give you the power to maintain this family's legacy?" Adrian stood tall, his heart pounding, but his resolve was unwavering. "I don't care about the legacy. I don't care about your fortune or your power. I love Maria, and that's all that matters to me." Mr. Donovan's face hardened, his features twisting in barely restrained fury. "If you go through with this," he said, his voice cold as steel, "you will be cut off. No inheritance, No position in the company? You will have nothing." For a moment, the weight of those words hung in the air. Adrian knew his father wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a threat, it was a promise. To defy Mr. Donovan meant giving up everything: his place in the family business, his share of the vast fortune, the privileged life he had been born into. But Adrian had made his decision. His life with Maria would be built on love, not on money or power. And he knew that a future without her wasn't a future he wanted. "I don't need your money," Adrian said, his voice unwavering. "I'll make my own way." Mr. Donovan's eyes narrowed, a cold smile forming on his lips. "You've always been a fool, Adrian, just like your mother." The mention of his mother hit Adrian like a blow to the chest. His mother had died when he was young, but she had been the only source of warmth in his life. Mr. Donovan had always been ruthless, even with her, and Adrian had long suspected that his mother had been unhappy in her gilded cage. "You never understood her, just like you'll never understand me," Adrian said quietly. "This family isn't about love for you. It's about control, but I won't be controlled anymore." Without another word, Adrian turned and walked out of the library, leaving his father standing alone amidst the trappings of wealth and power that had defined his life. As Adrian made his way to the garden, the air was thick with tension. Guests had already started to arrive, their hushed whispers filling the space as they took their seats. The Donovan name carried immense weight, and the guest list was filled with the city's elite: politicians, business tycoons, and socialites. Many of them had heard the rumors about Adrian's choice of bride, but now, seeing it unfold before their eyes, they could barely contain their judgment. Adrian walked through the garden with his head held high. He could feel the eyes of the guests on him, their murmurs of disapproval buzzing in his ears. But none of that mattered. All he cared about was Maria. And there she was, at the far end of the garden, just outside the mansion's doors. Maria stood in her wedding gown. It was simple, elegant, and completely unadorned by the excess that surrounded them. The dress had been handmade, and while it lacked the diamonds and pearls that often grace the gowns of the wealthy brides in Adrian's social circle, it suited Maria perfectly. She stood with quiet grace, her dark hair cascading in soft waves down her back, her eyes filled with a mix of nerves and joy. As Adrian approached her, Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had never felt more out of place in her life. The grandeur of the Donovan estate, the judgmental stares of the elite guests, and the knowledge that Mr. Donovan was doing everything in his power to stop the wedding weighed heavily on her. But then she saw Adrian's face, his eyes filled with love and determination, and all her fears melted away. "You look beautiful," Adrian whispered as he reached her, his hand gently brushing her cheek. Maria smiled, though there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "Your father—" "I don't care what he says," Adrian interrupted, his voice firm. "All that matters is you." Maria's heart swelled with love. In that moment, the grand estate, the wealth, the disapproval of the guests, it all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the man standing before her, the man who had chosen her against all odds. As the ceremony began, the guests watched in stunned silence. It was a spectacle unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Adrian Donovan, the heir to a vast fortune, was marrying a maid. The whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd, each one laced with judgment and disbelief. "How could he marry her?" one guest muttered under their breath. "She's not even from a respectable family," another added, their voice dripping with disdain. "Mr. Donovan must be furious," a third whispered, glancing toward the mansion where the imposing figure of Mr. Donovan stood, watching from a distance. But Adrian and Maria saw none of it. As they stood before the officiant, their hands clasped together, they were lost in each other. The world around them faded, the disapproving whispers reduced to nothing more than background noise. All that existed was their love. The officiant's voice was steady, yet there was an undercurrent of tension as he began the ceremony. He too could sense the disapproval of the guests, but he carried on, determined to see the union through. Adrian's vows were spoken with a firmness that left no doubt of his commitment. "Maria, from the moment I met you, I knew there was something special about you. You see me for who I am, not for my name or my wealth, and I promise to stand by you, no matter what the world says. You are my heart, my future. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she listened to his words. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled, but her conviction was clear. Adrian, I never imagined that someone like you could love someone like me, but you've shown me that love doesn't care about wealth or status. I promise to love you, to support you, and to face whatever challenges come our way, together. As they exchanged rings, a sense of defiance hung in the air. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a stand against the world, against the expectations of society, and most of all, against Mr. Donovan's iron grip on his son's future. Standing in the distance, Mr. Donovan watched the ceremony with an expression as cold as the marble statues that lined the garden. His presence was a dark cloud over the celebration, his disapproval palpable even from afar. The guests occasionally glanced toward him, wondering if he would make a final move to stop the wedding. But Mr. Donovan did nothing. His silence was a declaration in itself. He had lost this battle, and the fury in his eyes promised that the war was far from over. The grand ballroom, adorned with shimmering chandeliers and walls draped in silk, had once seemed a sanctuary of celebration. The flowers, lilies, roses, and orchids, perfumed the air, weaving through the laughter and clinking of champagne glasses. But as the day edged closer to the moment Adrian and Maria would exchange their vows, the air inside the Donovan mansion began to feel heavy, oppressive, as if the building itself could sense the tension that lingered just beneath the surface. Outside, the skies, once blue and serene, slowly began to darken. Clouds gathered, thick and menacing, swirling like an omen. The breeze that fluttered through the open doors of the mansion shifted, growing colder, sharper. What had been a picture-perfect wedding day was beginning to turn. But no one, least of all Adrian and Maria, noticed the change. Their focus remained solely on each other, their eyes locked in a silent promise of love and defiance. As the officiant began the ceremony, the tension in the room thickened. Guests fidgeted in their seats, murmuring to one another in hushed tones. The whispers of disapproval, which had been stifled earlier by the grandeur of the event, now grew louder, a cacophony of judgment that could not be ignored. Adrian, standing tall beside Maria, felt the weight of those eyes upon him. He could feel their disapproval, their shock that he would defy his father's wishes so publicly, so brazenly. But he didn't care. He only had eyes for Maria, the woman who had captured his heart and soul. Her simple gown, free of the opulence expected in such a setting, was a stark contrast to the wealth surrounding them, yet she radiated a beauty that no jewel could match. Maria stood beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she held his. The weight of the room's judgment pressed heavily on her, but she clung to the strength Adrian offered her through his touch. His presence was a shield, blocking out the disapproving stares and whispered remarks. She could feel the intensity of his love, his determination to stand beside her no matter what, and it gave her courage. The officiant's voice, though calm, seemed to reverberate through the room like the first rumble of thunder in the distance. "We are gathered here today," he began, his eyes flicking nervously to the guests, as if sensing the unease, "to witness the union of two souls, Adrian Donovan and Maria Sanchez, who have chosen to join their lives in marriage." Thunder rolled softly in the distance, a low, ominous sound that seemed to echo the growing disquiet in the room. A few guests glanced toward the tall windows that lined the ballroom, their once clear panes now darkened by the approaching storm. It was as if nature itself was responding to the tension inside, its energy crackling in the air. Adrian squeezed Maria's hand gently, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't care what anyone thinks," he whispered softly to her. "This is our moment." Maria smiled through her nerves, her eyes glistening with tears. "I love you, Adrian," she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the rising wind outside. "No matter what happens." The officiant continued, oblivious to the growing storm, but everyone else in the room could feel it. The windows rattled slightly in their frames as the wind picked up, and a flash of lightning illuminated the sky outside, casting eerie shadows through the ballroom. The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Then it was time for the vows. Adrian took a deep breath and turned fully to Maria, his hands clasping hers. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with emotion, raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic. "Maria, from the moment I saw you, I knew you were different. You saw me for who I really am, not for my name or my family's fortune. You showed me what it means to love someone without conditions, without expectations. And I promise from this day forward to love you with that same purity, that same devotion. No matter what the world throws at us, I will always choose you. As Adrian spoke, another rumble of thunder shook the walls of the mansion. The storm outside was no longer a distant threat. It was upon them. Rain began to lash against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks in the door frames. But inside the ballroom, Adrian's words were a beacon of warmth amidst the coldness of the storm. Maria's heart swelled as she listened to him, her hands tightening around his. She had never imagined that a man like Adrian, a man of wealth, power, and privilege, would choose her, a simple maid, to be his wife. But as he spoke those words, she realized that none of that mattered. What they had was real, stronger than the wealth and power that surrounded them. When it was her turn to speak, Maria's voice trembled, but she stood tall, looking Adrian directly in the eyes. Adrian, I never thought I would find a love like this, especially not in a world so different from my own. But you've shown me that love doesn't care about the walls society builds to keep people apart. You've made me feel seen, cherished, and loved for who I am. I promise to stand by you, no matter how hard things get, no matter who tries to tear us apart. As her words echoed through the room, a sudden deafening crash of thunder shook the mansion. The chandeliers swayed, and the lights flickered briefly. The storm had arrived in full force, battering the walls of the estate as though nature itself was protesting the union taking place within. But Adrian and Maria stood firm, their vows unshaken by the chaos outside. The officiant, looking unnerved, quickly moved to conclude the ceremony. By the power vested in me, he said, his voice raised over the growing noise of the storm, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Adrian pulled Maria close, his hands gently cradling her face as he kissed her, sealing their vows in front of everyone who doubted them, who disapproved of them. For a moment it felt like the world disappeared. Just the two of them, locked in a moment of pure love and defiance. The storm outside, the judgment of the guests, even Mr. Donovan's looming presence faded away. But just as their lips met, the doors to the ballroom were thrown open with a violent gust of wind. The sudden force extinguished several candles, plunging parts of the room into shadow. The guests gasped, startled by the ferocity of the storm and the intrusion. And then, through the open doors, a figure appeared. Cloaked in darkness, the figure stepped into the ballroom, the wind swirling around him like a specter of the storm itself. His presence was immediately unsettling, sending a wave of cold air through the room. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire among the guests as they turned to see who had dared interrupt such a sacred moment. The figure moved forward, his boots echoing ominously on the marble floor. His long coat billowed behind him, wet from the rain, and his face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. But even in the dim light, there was an unmistakable air of power, of menace about him. Adrian broke away from Maria, his eyes narrowing as he stepped protectively in front of her. He didn't recognize the man, but there was no mistaking the danger that had just entered the room. "Who are you?" Adrian demanded, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. The figure stopped in the center of the room, his head slowly rising to reveal his face. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Adrian's with an unsettling intensity. "I am here," the man said in a low, gravelly voice, "because this marriage should never have happened." A collective gasp rippled through the room, the tension mounting to a fever pitch. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder. Who was this man, and why was he here? Adrian stepped forward, his anger rising. "You have no right to be here. This is our wedding." "Your wedding is a mistake," the man interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. "And it will not stand." The room was frozen in a state of shock. Maria clung to Adrian's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen this man before, but the fear in his eyes told her that whoever he was, he posed a threat. The storm raged outside, thunder crashing and lightning flashing through the windows, casting jagged shadows across the faces of the guests. The room, once filled with joy and celebration, had become a place of dread, of looming danger. Adrian stood his ground, his voice steady. "Who sent you?" The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. Your father. With those words, the entire room seemed to exhale in collective shock. The tension that had been brewing throughout the day now reached its peak. Everyone knew of Mr. Donovan's opposition to the wedding, but to send an intruder to disrupt the ceremony was beyond even what the most cynical had imagined. Adrian's blood ran cold. His father, the one person he had hoped to escape. Even now, after the vows had been exchanged, after Adrian had made his choice clear, his father still sought to control him. The storm outside roared louder, and the ballroom seemed to darken as if the storm itself was pressing in on them. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom, once charged with love and hope, had morphed into a cacophony of shock and uncertainty. The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering nervously, their faces a mix of disbelief and fear. Adrian stood tall, ready to protect Maria, his heart racing with a tumult of emotions. He had fought so hard for their love, and now, in this moment, everything he believed in was being challenged. The cloaked figure, still lurking in the shadows, finally stepped fully into the light. His features were rugged and weathered, with deep lines etched across his face that spoke of hardship and years lost. As he lifted his head, the remnants of a once handsome man could be seen, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were now filled with bitterness. Adrian, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I am your uncle, Marcus Donovan. Gasps erupted in the room, a symphony of shock resonating from the guests as they exchanged bewildered glances. Marcus Donovan? The brother Mr. Donovan had claimed was dead? The family secrets, which had lingered like shadows over their lives, were now crashing into the light. I was presumed dead, Marcus continued, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. But the truth is far darker than that. I've spent years in hiding, but I couldn't let the family continue this charade without exposing the truth. Adrian's head spun. He had grown up hearing whispers of the family's past, stories of betrayal and loss. But to hear it from a man who had lived through it all was surreal. What are you talking about? He demanded, trying to keep his voice steady, protectively positioning himself in front of Maria. The family fortune, Marcus said, taking a step closer, was built on lies. Lies that your father fed to everyone, including you. He wronged me to take everything for himself. When I stood in his way, he had me exiled, declared dead to the world. I was nothing but an obstacle to him, a loose end that needed tying up. The ballroom was enveloped in silence, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the air. Guests exchanged worried glances, many having heard rumors, but never knowing the truth. This was a revelation that threatened to upend everything they had believed about the Donovan legacy. How can we trust you? Adrian shot back, a mix of anger and disbelief flooding his senses. You could be lying to destroy my family. Marcus shook his head slowly, the bitterness in his eyes deepening. You think I want your father's fortune? I've seen the consequences of wealth and power firsthand. It destroyed him, and it will destroy you if you let it. I came here not to seek revenge, but to warn you, to save you from the same fate I suffered. Adrian's heart raced as he processed Marcus's words. A part of him wanted to dismiss the man as a bitter stranger, but another part could feel the truth lurking beneath the surface. His mind raced back to the late-night conversations he had overheard as a child, the hushed tones and furtive glances exchanged when the family thought he was asleep. There had always been something darker beneath the opulent facade of the Donovan mansion, but he had never imagined it could be this twisted. Enough of this, Mr. Donovan's voice thundered from the back of the room, cutting through the charged atmosphere. You're nothing but a liar, Marcus. You were weak, and weakness has no place in this family. You don't belong here. Yet here I am, Marcus replied, a defiance sparking in his gaze. Your grip on the fortune is slipping, brother. The world deserves to know the truth about you. You've built an empire on manipulation and betrayal, and it's time for it to crumble. At those words, the tension in the room snapped like a taut string. Guests shifted uneasily, many murmuring among themselves as they tried to make sense of what was happening. They had come to celebrate a union, but now they were thrust into a family drama that felt all too real. Maria clutched Adrian's arm, her heart racing. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the conflict between loyalty to his father and the growing realization that he had been shielded from the truth for too long. Adrian, we need to leave, Maria whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "This isn't our fight. We can start anew, away from all of this." Adrian turned to her, torn. The woman he loved was right. They could walk away from the madness, escape the suffocating weight of family expectations and betrayals. But the thought of abandoning his family, even one as fractured as this, felt like a betrayal in itself. "I can't just leave, Maria. This is my family, and I need to know the truth." Maria looked into his eyes, searching for the right words. "But at what cost, Adrian? Look at what's happening. Your father is a tyrant, and he will not take this lying down. If you confront him now, it could destroy everything, us included." The sound of a nearby chandelier crashing to the floor broke through their conversation, sending shards of glass scattering across the marble tiles. Gasps echoed in the room as everyone turned their attention back to the unfolding drama. The storm outside continued to rage, as if echoing the turmoil within the mansion's walls. "Don't you see?" Marcus pressed, taking another step closer, urgency in his voice. "Your father's power is built on fear. If you don't confront him now, you'll never be free. You and Maria deserve a life without the shadows of this family hanging over you. Stand with me. Together, we can bring down the fortress he's built on lies." Adrian hesitated, his mind racing. The thought of fighting against his father felt insurmountable, but the idea of staying silent, allowing the cycle of betrayal to continue, gnawed at him. Could he really turn his back on the only family he had ever known? Yet at the same time, could he ignore the truth that was being laid bare before him? Suddenly, Mr. Donovan erupted with anger, his face twisted in fury. "Enough! You think you can come into my home and dictate the terms? You're nothing to me, Marcus. You're a ghost of the past." "Then let's bury the past once and for all," Marcus interjected fiercely. "It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The tension in the room reached a boiling point, the atmosphere charged with the energy of years of unspoken words, repressed emotions, and familial strife. Adrian felt torn between his love for Maria and his loyalty to a father who had shaped his life in ways he was just beginning to understand. But as he looked at Maria, her face a mixture of fear and determination, he knew he had to make a choice. "Enough!" Adrian shouted, silencing the room. He turned to his father, standing tall despite the tremors of uncertainty coursing through him. "You've spent my entire life keeping secrets and using your power to control everyone around you. It ends today." Mr. Donovan's eyes narrowed, his expression a blend of rage and disbelief. "You dare speak to me like that, boy? I built this family from nothing." "And what have you built?" Adrian shot back, his voice gaining strength. "A house of cards that will come crashing down the moment someone dares to challenge you. I'm done living in your shadow, and I'm done allowing your mistakes to define my life." As those words fell from his lips, the room seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside roared in response, a fitting backdrop to the eruption of family tension unfolding within the mansion's walls. Adrian turned to Marcus, his heart racing as he felt a sense of solidarity with the man standing before him. "I believe you, Uncle Marcus. It's time for the truth to come out. We can't let the fear of the past dictate our future." As the words left his lips, Adrian felt a rush of determination. He knew that this battle would not be easy, that confronting his father would open old wounds and unleash a storm of chaos. But for the first time, he felt a sense of liberation, a promise of freedom from the suffocating expectations that had weighed him down for too long. Adrian's decision was made. He would stand and fight for his love, for the truth, and for a future that he believed could be brighter. With Maria by his side, he would take on the storms of his past, unearthing the darkness that had plagued his family for too long. Together, they would rise from the ashes of betrayal and carve a new path forward, free from the shadows of deceit. As the winds howled outside and the storm raged on, Adrian faced the dawning task ahead, feeling a spark of hope ignite within him. He had chosen love over fear, truth over deception, and in that moment, he knew that he would not back down. Together, he and Maria would navigate the storm, emerging stronger on the other side, ready to embrace whatever came next. But as the storm outside continued to rage, Adrian knew that the true tempest lay within the Donovan family, and the real fight was only just beginning. The secrets that had been buried for too long were about to be unearthed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The chaos in the ballroom simmered, awaiting the next act in this twisted family drama, a reckoning that would change everything. The ballroom was a whirlwind of chaos, emotions swirling like the storm raging outside. Adrian stood firm at the center of it all, his heart pounding with resolve. The weight of his father's disappointment was heavy, but it felt lighter than the burden of living a lie. The hushed whispers of the guests echoed in his ears, but all he could focus on was Maria, the woman who had fought so hard to be by his side, the woman who had shown him what love truly meant. Adrian turned to face Mr. Donovan, his father's once imposing figure now diminished in the wake of the storm. The man who had controlled every aspect of Adrian's life now sat in silent defeat, his icy demeanor melting away to reveal a vulnerability that Adrian had never seen before. This was not the powerful patriarch who had instilled fear in his heart. This was a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. "Father," Adrian began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "You've spent my entire life teaching me that wealth is power, but I see now that it is nothing compared to love. Love is what makes us human, what connects us to one another. I can't live in a world where I must choose money over the person I love." Mr. Donovan's gaze faltered, the fire in his eyes extinguished. "You think this is easy for me? I did everything for you, to build a future that would keep you safe. You're throwing it all away for a girl who scrubs floors." "She is not just a girl, Father," Adrian retorted, his voice rising. "She is my partner, my equal, and the only person who has ever understood me. You may see her as beneath us, but I see her as my everything. I won't be part of a family that values status over love." The room fell silent, the guests shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between father and son. They had witnessed a spectacle that few could comprehend, a true rebellion against the norms that dictated their lives. Adrian felt a surge of adrenaline as he stood his ground. There was no going back. This was his moment to break free from the shackles of expectation. Maria squeezed Adrian's hand tighter, her heart racing in tandem with his. She could feel the tension between the two men, the chasm of misunderstandings and unspoken truths that had widened over the years. For a fleeting moment, she felt fear creep into her heart. Would Adrian's resolve crumble under the weight of his father's expectations? But as she looked into Adrian's eyes, she saw the strength of his conviction shining brightly. He was not just fighting for their love, he was fighting for himself. "Adrian, think about what you're doing," Mr. Donovan implored, desperation creeping into his voice. "You're rejecting everything I've built for you. You're choosing a life of struggle over one of comfort. Is that truly what you want?" "I want to be happy, Father," Adrian replied, his voice softer now, yet resolute. "I want to build a life on my terms. I don't need your fortune or your approval. I need love and honesty, and I want to share that with Maria." The storm outside seemed to echo Adrian's words, the thunder rumbling like an agreement from the heavens. It felt like a cleansing, a promise that their love could weather any storm. As the winds howled, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the ballroom, casting eerie shadows across the guests' faces. It was a reminder that change was upon them, that nothing would ever be the same again. "Adrian, please," Mr. Donovan said, his voice trembling, revealing a crack in his usually steadfast exterior. "I've spent my life building this empire. I did it for you. I can't lose you too." "You lost me the moment you chose power over family," Adrian replied, his heart heavy with the realization that his father's love had always been conditional. The revelation was painful, yet liberating. He was no longer bound by his father's expectations. At that moment, Adrian felt a surge of determination. He turned to Maria, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope. "Let's go, Maria. We don't need this place to be happy. We'll create our own future together." "Adrian, wait!" Mr. Donovan called out, his voice breaking as the reality of losing his son set in. "I can give you anything you want. Just tell me what it is." But Adrian shook his head, refusing to look back. He took a step forward, pulling Maria along with him, their hands intertwined as they made their way toward the exit. They were leaving behind the gilded cage that had been built around them, ready to embrace the unknown. As they walked through the crowd of stunned guests, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the air. The grand ballroom, once filled with laughter and celebration, had transformed into a battleground of shattered dreams. But for Adrian and Maria, it was a chance for a new beginning. Once outside, they were met with the storm's fury, but it felt different now. Instead of oppressive and daunting, it felt cleansing, invigorating. The rain poured down, drenching them instantly, yet they stood together, unafraid. The storm became a metaphor for their fight against the world. Together, they would weather any tempest that came their way. "Where do we go now?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible over the rain, but her heart was filled with hope. Adrian smiled, wiping the rain from his eyes as he took a deep breath. "We go wherever love leads us. We can find a small place, maybe even a cottage, somewhere far from all of this. We can start fresh, just you and me." "But what about money?" Maria questioned, the reality of their situation settling in. "What if we struggle?" "Struggling together is better than living a lie in luxury," Adrian replied firmly, his heart brimming with optimism. "We can build a life, brick by brick, and we'll do it with love as our foundation. No more deceit, no more shadows." The rain continued to pour, and as they walked away from the mansion, a feeling of lightness washed over them. The world seemed brighter, the air fresher. They were stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in his life, Adrian felt a sense of freedom. Days turned into weeks, and the couple found a small cottage on the outskirts of town. It was modest but filled with potential. They rolled up their sleeves, each contributing in ways they had never imagined. Adrian planted a small garden while Maria painted the walls in bright, inviting colors. They spent evenings cooking together, laughter filling the air as they tried new recipes and made memories. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. They faced challenges, financial struggles, moments of self-doubt, and the lingering specter of Mr. Donovan's disapproval. But through it all, their love remained steadfast. They learned to communicate openly, sharing their fears and dreams, building a partnership that transcended their pasts. One day, as Adrian tended to the garden, he found a small patch of wildflowers blooming amidst the vegetables. He knelt down, admiring the vibrant colors, and felt a pang of inspiration. Those wildflowers represented resilience, just like their love. They had thrived despite the storms they had faced. "Maria!" Adrian called out, his voice brimming with excitement. "Come look at this!" She rushed over, her eyes widening at the sight. "They're beautiful, just like us." "Yes," Adrian grinned. "They remind me of how far we've come. We've built something real here, and we can keep growing no matter what life throws at us." In that moment, Adrian realized that true wealth was not found in material possessions or societal status. It was found in the richness of their shared experiences, in the laughter that echoed through their home, and in the love that enveloped them like a warm embrace. As time passed, the bond between Adrian and Maria deepened. They often reminisced about the chaotic day of their wedding, the storm that had swept through the mansion, and the dark secrets that had been unveiled. They had emerged from the chaos stronger and more united than ever. Word of their love story spread throughout the community, inspiring others to challenge societal norms and choose love over materialism. People began to see that true happiness didn't lie in wealth or power, but in the connections they forged with one another. Eventually, Adrian and Maria decided to host a gathering at their cottage, a celebration of love, resilience, and community. They invited friends, neighbors, and even a few guests from their past who had supported them through their journey. On the day of the gathering, laughter filled the air as people mingled in the garden, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company. The sun cast a golden glow on everything, illuminating the wildflowers that had bloomed alongside their hard work. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian stood before the gathering, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you all for being here today. Maria and I have learned that love is the most powerful force in the world. It transcends wealth, status, and even family ties. We are so grateful to have each of you in our lives, supporting us on this journey." A round of applause erupted, and Maria's eyes sparkled with tears of joy. In that moment, surrounded by their chosen family, they understood that love had truly prevailed. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the cottage, Adrian and Maria shared a quiet moment together, reflecting on how far they had come. They stood hand in hand, feeling the weight of their past lift as they embraced the future, ready to face whatever came their way, together. And as they watched the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, they knew that their love was an unbreakable bond, a testament to the power of choosing each other, regardless of the storms that had once threatened to tear them apart. They had found their true home, not in a mansion filled with wealth, but in the love they had cultivated together, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing day. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.